Hi, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this. My name is Cherie and welcome back to my ASMR channel. Talk about long time no see. So, I don't really have a prompt for wanting to film this video. I just kind of did. So, I thought, because it is Halloween, and as I am uploading this, Halloween night, I know there will inevitably be some people out there who will be spending maybe this holiday alone or otherwise preoccupied, or will not be able to necessarily celebrate it in the way that they would like. Whether that's, wanting to go to a party and being stuck doing revision or something, or if everyone else is occupied with their own things and you're kind of stuck at home, maybe you can't even do a movie night, or you're just wanting to do a movie night by yourself. I totally get that. That's possibly the majority of my Halloween experiences, if I'm honest, even though it's one of my favourite holidays. And I thought, if that's the case for you, or even if it's not, and you're watching this another night, that's the beauty of YouTube. You can kind of watch things whenever. Revolutionary technology, I know. I thought I'd try and keep you company, because I've been there. I understand. Oh, also, before I forget to mention, I have kind of Halloween themed nails, because that's the kind of person I am. I always get themed nails for holidays. I have a couple of little spider webs. I'm not sure how well you can see those. I also have some sparkly orange ones. I think they're quite cute. And as well as that, I have a little ghost in a graveyard, and I'm trying to not look too crude while I do this. But yeah, that's him. Please don't ban me, Susan. I promise I was doing it for a reason. But yeah, so like I said, I love this holiday, and I thought, let's spend a little bit of time together celebrating it in our own way. So all I'm going to be doing for this video is doing a bit of nail tapping, because I love doing that. And when you have the beauty of artificial nails, which I have, it's one of those habits you kind of get into doing all the time, annoying every single person around you. And also, I'm going to light a couple of Yankee candles to set the mood. I unfortunately could not do a massive candle haul because my bank account wasn't cooperating, but I got a couple of scents that I thought seemed the nicest to me. And as well as that, we're also going to read some scary stories that I found online. So this will be a couple of my favourite creepypastas, because I'm a big old sucker for creepypastas. Anyway, let's light some candles. I can already smell it. French, it's a pomme et cedar. I'm sorry to everyone in France for that attempt. It doesn't really give you a description of what it smells like, apart from the fact that it's a cider house. So you're just gonna have to take my word that it smells like apples. Definitely a very appley smell, but not pure apple, if that makes any sort of sense. It's apple with, I guess what you would say apple cider. It's probably what it is. Aha! Yay! One down, one to go. I don't know about you guys, but there is nothing I personally find more relaxing than a nice smelly candle. Always puts me in such a nice mood. And this is such an autumnal scent, if you know what I mean. Or I guess you could call it a fall scent if you're across the pond. But yeah, I just love a candle. I kind of want to name him, or her, or they. How about Owl? I think it's an owl. Owl, the Farmer's Market Collection Yankee Candle. I am kind of paranoid about my hair going up in flames. So if that happens, well, at least I got it on camera. I think this one looks so cool. This one is Haunted Hayride. I don't really know what a haunted hayride is supposed to smell like. Let's open it up and see. Oh, that was a crisp pop. It's not going to do it again. It smells really fresh. I guess like you're going through a forest. Kind of like what the picture would suggest. Now let's light this one too. Oh, I love this. It really is the small things in life. I apologise, by the way, if I keep looking into the viewfinder rather than the actual camera. I know, rookie mistake, but you know, what can you do? I am a rookie. I just had to cut that because I bent my thumb because I'm an idiot. But look how pretty it looks. So we have Alf and we have, we'll go Harriet. Harriet the Haunted Hayride Candle and Alf the Apple Cider House. Cute. Let me take a drink and then we'll get into the stories. I love this tumbler, by the way. I bring it out every Halloween. It actually looks taller than me in the camera, I just realised. It's definitely starting starting to show some wear and tear, but I love it. I still think it's cool. It's got a bit of condensation there. Sorry, I've just got some Diet Coke and ice in there. But yeah, it's Nightmare Before Christmas themed, and I've had it for ages. Then it has different silhouettes on both sides, but you can't really see them because it's, like I said, all clouded up with condensation. Looks better in person, I won't lie. If you want to, you can pause this video, get your own candles going, grab a cozy blanket and get a drink, a hot drink probably, and then settle in with me for a little while and we'll just prattle about with some stories. Or you can stay. I'm not your mum. Let's get the show on the road. Okay, so I'm gonna read, hopefully, 3 stories for you today. Now, these are a couple of my favourite internet stories. These are just some of my favourites, and they're definitely not my only favourite stories. They're just the ones I think would be more manageable, because some of the others are really, really long, and I think we'd be here all night. Right, let's go. So, the original author for this story is a person called Slime Beast. So, you know, that's what you really need to know. Let's get into it. Settle in for the ride. Some of you may have heard that the Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real, live ghost town. Disney built the Treasure Island Resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't start as a ghost town. Disney's cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. This is a fact. Look it up. Disney blew $30 million on the place. Yes, $30 million. Then they abandoned it. Disney blamed the shallow waters, too shallow for their ships to safely operate, and there was even blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas, they were too lazy to work a regular schedule. That's where the factual nature of their story ends. It wasn't because of sand, and it obviously wasn't because foreigners are lazy. Both are convenient excuses. No, I sincerely doubt those reasons were legitimate. Why don't I buy the official story? Because of Mowgli's Palace. Near the beachside city of Emerald Isle in North Carolina, Disney began construction of Mowgli's Palace in the late 1990s. The concept was a jungle-themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the centre of the whole thing. If you're unfamiliar with the character of Mowgli, then you might better remember the story, The Jungle Book. If you haven't seen it anywhere else, you'd know it as the Disney cartoon from decades past. Mowgli is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals and simultaneously threatened / pursued by other animals. Mowgli's Palace was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney bought up a ton of high-priced land for the project, and there was actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes and then turned around and sold the properties to Disney. At one point, a home that had just been constructed was immediately condemned with little to no explanation. The land grabbed by the government was supposedly for some fictional highway project. Knowing full well what was going on, people started calling it Mickey Mouse Highway. Then there was the concept art. A group of stuffed shirts from Disney Co. actually held a city meeting. They intended to sell everyone and how lucrative this project was going to be for everyone. When they showed the concept art, this gigantic Indian palace surrounded by jungle, staffed with men and women in loincloth and tribal gear, well, suffice to say, everyone flipped their shit. We're talking about a large Indian palace, jungle and loincloths, not only in the centre of a relatively wealthy area, but also a somewhat xenophobic area of the southern USA. It was a questionable mix at that point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he was quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. Disney took that community and essentially broke it over its knee as well. The houses were razed, the land was cleared, and there wasn't a damned thing anyone could do or say about it. Local TV and newspapers were against the resort at the beginning, but some insane connection between Disney's media holdings and the local venues came into play, and their opinions turned on a dime. So, anyway, Treasure Island, the Bahamas, Disney sunk those millions in and then split. The same thing happened with Mowgli's Palace. Construction was complete. Visitors actually stayed at the resort. The surrounding communities were flooded with traffic and the usual annoyances associated with an influx of lost and irate tourists. Then it all just stopped. Disney shut it down, and nobody knew what the hell to think. But they were pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a large group of folks who didn't want this in the first place. I, honestly, didn't give the place another thought since hearing it closed over a decade ago. I live maybe 4 hours from Emerald Isle, so really I only heard the rumblings and didn't experience any of it firsthand. Then, I read this article from someone who had explored the Treasure Island resort and posted a whole blog about this crazy shit he found there. Stuff just left behind. Things smashed, defaced, and probably ruined by the disgruntled former employees who had lost their jobs. Hell, the locals from all around probably had a hand in the wrecking that place. People there felt just as angry about Treasure Island as folks here did about Mowgli's Palace. Plus, there were rumours that Disney had released their aquarium stock into the local waters when they closed, including sharks. Who wouldn't want to take a few swings at some merchandise after that? Well, what I'm getting into is that this blog about Treasure Island got me thinking. Even though many years had passed since its closing, I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploration at Mowgli's Palace. Take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if there was anything I could take home as a memento. I'm not going to say I wasted no time in getting there, because honestly it took me another year after I first found that Treasure Island article to get around to going up to Emerald Isle. Over the course of that year, I did a lot of research on the Palace Resort, or rather, I tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made any mention of that place. That had been scrubbed clean. Even odder, however, was that nobody before myself had apparently thought to blog about the place or even post a photo. None of the local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though that was to be expected since they all swung Disney's way. They wouldn't be out here lauding their embarrassment, you know? Recently, I learned that corporations can actually ask Google, for example, to remove links from search results, basically for no good reason. Looking back, it's probably that nobody spoke of the resort, but rather their words were made inaccessible. So, in the end, I could barely find the place. All I had to go on was an old-as-hell map I'd received in the mail back in the 90s. It was a promotional item sent out to people who had recently been to Disney World, and I guess since I had been there in the late 80s, that was recent. I didn't really intend to hang on to it. It just got shoved in with my books and comics from my childhood. I'd only remembered it months into my research, and even then it took me another few weeks to locate the storage bin my parents had shoved it all into. But I did find it. The locals were no help, and most were transplants who had moved to the beach in recent years, or old residents who just sneered at me and made rude gestures the second I managed to say, where would I find Mowgli's Palace? The drive took me through an inordinately long corridor of overgrowth. Tropical plants that had run rampant and overpopulated the area mixed with the native species of flora that actually belonged there and had tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort. Tremendous monolithic wooden gates whose supports to either side looked like they must have been cut from giant sequoias. The gate itself had been gouged in several places by woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Hanging on the gate was a sheet of metal, some random scrap, with hand-painted letters scrawled in black, "Abandoned by Disney." Clearly the handiwork of some past local or an employee who wanted to make some small protest. The gates were open enough to walk through, but not drive, so grabbing my digital camera and the map, whose flip side showed a layout of the resort, I set off on foot. The inner grounds of the place were just as overgrown as the entryway. Palm trees stood unattended and ragged among piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants similarly stood in their own stinking, bug-riddled refuse. and there was this sort of clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers mixed with obnoxious tall weeds and stinking blackened mushrooms. All that remained of any outdoor structures were broken, rotting wood and various charred bits of unidentifiable material. What was most likely an information booth or an outdoor bar was now simply a pile of assorted debris chopped up by past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting thing on the grounds was a statue of Baloo, the friendly bear from the Jungle Book, which stood out in a sort of courtyard in front of the main building. He was frozen in a jovial wave toward no one, staring into empty space with a silly, toothy grin as bird shit covered the whole swaths of his fur and vines ensnared his platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only to find the outside of the building covered in graffiti where the original paint hadn't peeled and chipped away. The front doors weren't just open, they'd been taken off their hinges and were stolen. Above the front doors, or the gaping maw where they had been, someone had once again painted, "Abandoned by Disney." Wish I could tell you about all the awesome stuff I saw inside the palace. Forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, a full-fledged secret society of homeless bums. But no. The inside of the building was so stark, so bare, that I actually think people had stolen the moulding off the walls. Anything that was too big to steal, counters, desks, giant fake trees, they were all resting amid this empty echo chamber that amplified my every step like the slow rat-tat-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan and headed to all the locations that might seem in any way interesting. The kitchen was as you'd imagine, an industrial food prep area with all the appliances in space, no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled like very old piss. The huge freezer, not even remotely cool now, had row upon row of empty shelf space. Hooks hung from the ceiling, probably for hanging cuts of meat. And as I stood inside for a moment, I noticed they were swinging. Each hook swung in a random direction, but their movements were so slow and small that it was almost impossible to see. I figured it had been caused by my footsteps, so I stopped one from swinging by clutching it in my fist, then carefully letting it go. But within seconds, it started to swing once more. The bathrooms were in much the same state as the rest of the place. Just like the Treasure Island resort, someone had methodically smashed each porcelain commode with coconuts and other implements. There was about half an inch of rancid, stinking, stagnant water on the floor, so I didn't stay there very long. What's odd is that the toilets and the sinks all dripped, leaked, or just ran freely. It seemed to me that they should have shut the water off long, long ago. There were plenty of rooms in the resort, but naturally I didn't have time to look through them all. The few I did peer into were similarly wrecked, and I didn't expect to find anything there. I thought there was actually a television or radio in one room, as I really think I heard a quiet conversation coming out, though it was like a whisper. Probably my own breathing echoing in the silence, or just another case of the sound of flowing water playing tricks on the mind. This is what it sounded like. "I don't believe it. I didn't know that. Your father told you." I know, that sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced, why I thought there might have been something running in that room, or worse, some vagrants who had holed up in there and probably would have knifed me. At the front doors of the palace again, I figured I hadn't found anything of note and had wasted the trip up. As I looked out the door, I noticed something interesting in the courtyard that I'd apparently missed, something that would give me at least one thing to show for all my trouble, even if it was just a photograph. There, as a lifelike statue of a python, maybe 80 feet long, coiled up and sunning itself on a pedestal right in the centre of the area. It was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell on the object in the perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo. Then I stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved closer again to get the detail of its face. Slowly, casually, the python lifted its head, looked directly into my eyes, turned and slithered off the pedestal across the grass and into the trees. All 80 feet of it. Its head long disappeared into the woods before its tail even left the sunning spot. Disney had released all their exotic animals onto the grounds. Right there on my floor plan was the reptile house. I should have known. I'd read about the sharks at Treasure Isle, and I should have known they'd done this. I was dumbfounded, just utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back down to earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed away from where the snake had been, back toward the palace. Even though it was totally gone, I still wasn't taking any chances, and backed my way into the building. It took a few deep breaths and slaps to my own face to get myself right in the head again after that. I looked for a place to sit down, as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at that point. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline in the broken glass and dead leaf carpet or haul myself up onto a desk of questionable reliability. I had seen some stairs near the palace's lobby and decided to go have a seat there until I felt better. The staircase was far enough away from the front of the building to be relatively clean, save for a startling accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall, once again painted with the "abandoned by Disney" motto I'd become accustomed to. I placed the wedge on the stairs and sat on it to at least keep somewhat clean. The stairway led downward, below ground level. Using my camera flash as a sort of improvised flashlight, I could see that the staircase ended in a metal mesh door with a padlock. A sign on the door, a real sign, read "Mascots Only." Thank you. This perked up my spirits a little bit, for two reasons. One, a mascots only area would have definitely had some interesting stuff back in the day. Two, the padlock was still in place. Nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. This was the one place I could actually explore and perhaps find something interesting to photograph or wantonly steal. I'd come to the palace essentially agreeing with myself that it was okay to take anything I wanted to because, hey, abandoned. It didn't take much time to bust the lock. Well, actually that's wrong. It didn't take much to bust the metal plate on the wall that the padlock was hooked to. Time and decay had done most of the work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the screws out of the wall, something nobody else had apparently thought of, or hadn't been able to do at the time. The mascots only area was a startling and very welcomed change from the rest of the building I'd seen. For one, every second or third fluorescent light overhead was illuminated, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Also, nothing had been stolen or broken, even if age and exposure were definitely taking their toll. Tables had notepads and pens, there were clocks, even a punch-in clock on the wall complete with filled-out time cards. Chairs were scattered around, and there was even a small break room with an old static-filled television and long rotted-out food and drink on the counters. It was like one of those post-apocalyptic movies where everything is left in a state of evacuation. As I walked the maze-like sub-basement hallways of the mascots-only area, the sights just became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over, papers scattered and almost melded with the damp floor, and a large carpet of mould was slowly overtaking the real rotting crimson floor covering. Everything was sort of squishy. Anything wood disintegrated into mush when I applied even the least amount of force, and clothing items hanging on hooks in one of the rooms simply fell to moist threads if I tried to unhook them. One thing that annoyed me was that the light was becoming more sparse and unreliable as I went further into the dank, suffocating depths of the place. Eventually, I reached a black and yellow striped door with the words "Character Prep 1" stenciled onto it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured this was probably where the costumes were kept, and I definitely wanted a photo of that twisted, stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door wouldn't budge. That is, until I gave up and started to walk away. That was when there was a slight popping sound, and the door creaked open slowly. Inside, the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used the camera flash to look for a light switch in the wall by the door, but there was nothing. As I made my search, I was jarred out of my sense of excitement by a loud electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed to life, flickering and fading in and out like the rest I had passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed like the light was going to just keep getting brighter until all the bulbs exploded. But just when I thought it would reach that critical stage, the lights dimmed a bit and steadied. The room was exactly as I had pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung on the walls, fully put together like strange cartoon cadavers hung from invisible nooses. There was an entire rack of loincloths and native clothes on hangers toward the back. What I found odd, and what I wanted to photograph right away, was a Mickey Mouse costume at the centre of the room. Unlike the other costumes, it was lying on its back in the centre of the floor, like a murder victim. The fur on the costume was rotten and shedding, creating bare patches. What was even odder, however, was the colouring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of the actual Mickey Mouse. Black where he should be white, and white where he should be black. His normally red overalls were light blue. The sight was off-putting enough that I actually put off photographing the thing until last. I took a picture of the costumes hanging on the walls. Upward angles, downward angles, side shots to show an entire row of frozen, putrid cartoon faces, some with plastic eyes missing. Then I decided to stage a shot. Just one of the bedraggled character heads on the slick, grimy floor. I reached for the headpiece of a Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked into the face of the wide-eyed, mouldering head, a loud clattering sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet, and there between my shoes was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at my feet. Only the empty face and lower jaw remained, staring up at me. I dropped the duck head immediately, as you'd expect, and moved for the door. As I stood in the doorway, I looked back to the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture of it, you know. I had to, for any number of reasons that may seem silly, but only if you don't think it through. I'd need proof of what happened, especially if Disney was going to somehow make this go away. I had no doubt in my mind, right from the start, that even if it was just gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when Mickey, that photo negative opposite Mickey in the middle of the floor, started to get up. First sitting up, then climbing to its feet. The Mickey Mouse costume, or whoever was inside of it, stood there at the centre of the room, its fake face just staring directly at me as I mumbled, "No," over and over and over. With shaking hands, a violently thrashing heart, and legs that had once again turned to jelly, I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposite creature now quietly sizing me up. The digital camera screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, marring the screen wherever Mickey's outline moved to. Then the camera died, went blank and quiet and broken. I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey Mouse costume. "Hey," it said, in a hushed, perverted but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice. "Wanna see my head come off?" It started to pull at its own head, working its clumsy, glove-clad fingers around its neck with clawing, impatient movements, similar to a wounded man trying to pull himself free of a predator's jaws. As it worked its digits into its neck, so much blood, so much thick, chunky, yellow blood. I turned away as I heard a sickening tearing of cloth and flesh, only cared about getting away. Above the doorway of this room, I saw the final message clawed into the metal, with bone or fingernails. "Abandoned by God." I never got the pictures out of the camera. I never wrote my blog entry about it. After I ran from that place, fled for my sanity, if not my very life, I knew why Disney didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in. They didn't want anything like that getting out. Ugh. I have chills. I love that story so much. It was actually one of the first creepypastas I ever read years ago. Yeah, it's one of my favourites. Next up, we're going to read Happy Sun Daycare. This creepypasta was written by Chelsea Adams 524. Just a few miles outside of town stood an old country house. It had been converted into a daycare where parents would drop off their kids for the day and pick them up in the evening. However, said daycare had been out of business for a few years now. There was a sign posted in the front yard just a few feet from the house that read, Happy Sun Daycare, with a drawing of a cute-looking cartoony sun painted on it. A slide, a couple of swing sets, some monkey bars and a merry-go-round were once covered by swarms of children as they ran and played in the outdoors. They had since become perches for the local birds and squirrels and were swarmed by ants rather than children. I decided to write a report on the Happy Sun Daycare for the news blog I worked for. For one thing, several of the citizens today had gone to that daycare. I figured it might make for an interesting story to read about their experiences there and if it affected their life in any way. The other reason wasn't quite so innocent. There had always been concerned parents who would fret over leaving their child in someone else's care. That constant worry over how safe their sons and daughters were, especially with all the horror stories posted online about various daycare-related tragedies. For my report, I decided I would interview both employees and people who had gone to the daycare as children. I wanted to get as many different points of view as possible so that it wouldn't seem too terribly biased. Of course, I agreed not to use their real names for the sake of their privacy. The first person I interviewed was a middle-aged woman who looked after the infants at the daycare. For the sake of her privacy, we'll just call her Margaret. What was it like working at the daycare? I asked her. She replied, Oh, it wasn't anything too spectacular. Just your typical day of working with children, or babies in my case. I see, I told her before I asked. Have you had any problems while working there? Margaret shook her head. With the babies? Of course not. They could be fussy, but they weren't any trouble at all. The children were another story. This piqued my interest. Were the children that attended Happy Sun Daycare too much for the employees to handle? Or could it be that there were cases of abuse going on that had been kept secret until now? I had to find out. Why might that be? I asked. Well, Margaret paused for a second as though she was apprehensive about speaking to me. There were times when I heard muffled squealing. No, not squealing. Screaming. At first I thought it was just the children pretending to be scared, but the more I heard it, the more I realised those screams were real, that something was terrifying or possibly even hurting them. Did you ever see any children get hurt? Margaret nodded. Yes, most of them were just the typical scrapes and bruises you'd expect to find on a child who fell while playing or who bumped his head while trying to show off to his or her friends. Some of them, though, seemed off to me. Every so often I would see a child walk past on the way to the nurse's office, and each time the child looked like he'd been scratched or even bitten. Children scratched or bitten. That would be cause for alarm for anyone. Perhaps some wild animal had decided to make its home near the daycare and curious children had gotten too close. Maybe a stray dog had wandered into the playground and some poor unknowing kid wanted to pet it. Were there any animals in the area? I decided to ask. Stray dogs, raccoons, possibly a possum nest? I doubt it. Pets weren't allowed at the daycare and traps were set up at night to keep any wildlife away, though there might have been a dog roaming around the area. Margaret shook her head. I pointed out, perhaps it was the dog that had bitten those children? Oh, I only heard the dog, she told me. I'd never actually seen it, and all I heard were the occasional growl, snarl, or howl. So, Margaret had only heard what sounded like a dog. I couldn't rule out the possibility that perhaps she had mistaken some noise she heard of that for a dog. Maybe she had heard some children that were only pretending to be dogs and mistook them for a real one. Or maybe she had heard the wind and thought it was a howl. If that were the case, that would explain the scratches and bites she saw on some of the children. It wasn't too out of the realm of possibility that a child could have simply scratched his or her arm on a branch or part of the fence by accident. With what sounded like a dog's growl to her, Margaret could have reached the conclusion that the children were being attacked by some sort of stray canine. Still, I had to learn more about the daycare. With the possibility of a cover-up regarding a series of dog attacks, I figured the next person to interview would be one of the former attendees. Perhaps one of them would have childhood memories that could potentially shed some light on what Margaret had mentioned. After doing some background checking, I managed to find a young man who went to Happy Sun Daycare when he was around 5 or 6. Let's call him Scott. I found Scott working at a local butcher shop. I had to wait until his shift was over before I could start the interview. Luckily it wasn't too long of a wait, and it gave me some time to consider what to ask him. "Do you remember anything about Happy Sun Daycare?" I asked. "I know it was a long time ago for you, but perhaps you can recall something?" Scott thought for a moment before replying. "Not much. I was only 5, maybe 6 when I went. I can remember just doing what kids do at that age. Play, finger paint, watch cartoons, that kind of stuff." I nodded. "Were you a good kid?" "For the most part," he admitted. "Occasionally I'd get into some trouble, nothing too serious though. Just your typical kid fuzziness, not wanting to take naps, refusing to eat veggies, that sort of thing." "I see," I replied as I wrote down what he told me in a notepad. "And was the daycare fair in how they disciplined you?" "Somewhat. All I ever got was a scolding and the occasional timeout. Pretty much they made you sit in a corner for a few minutes until they thought you were ready to join the other kids. Though you were lucky if that's all you got," Scott pointed out. What Scott said baffled me a bit. They were lucky? How? I began to wonder if perhaps there had been more severe punishments for the more unruly children that had attended the daycare. Could there have been some sort of more controversial form of discipline that the employees at Happy Sun Daycare used that they didn't want to be known to the public? I had to know. "What exactly do you mean?" For a brief moment, Scott gave a brief shudder. He seemed to recall something from his childhood that frightened him and seemed to have affected him in his adulthood as well. "The kids who got into real trouble were sent into the grey door." Scott heaved a heavy sigh. "I've never been in there myself. I knew a few kids that did. Ones that would get into fights or throw huge tantrums. They'd end up going into that room. I don't know what happened in there, but they'd always come out shaking with wide eyes. A few would break down crying, some would scream, one kid even threw up before passing out." I frowned slightly. What sort of horrors had been conducted in the room that had been nicknamed the Grey Door? I then remembered what Margaret had told me, and decided to check and see if perhaps there was a connection with her story and what Scott had just said. "Did the children have any scratches or bites on them?" I asked. "And did you hear any strange noises?" He nodded. "A few kids had scratches on them after they left the Grey Door, but I thought they got those before and I just didn't notice them at first. They could have tripped or something. I did hear some heavy breathing. That could have just been some kid panting from running a lot. Hard to say for sure." First, Margaret had said she thought she heard a dog snarling, and now Scott told me he heard heavy breathing. With the strange noises, mysterious scratches on misbehaving children, and the mystery of the Grey Door room, I couldn't help but wonder what it was the Happy Sun Daycare had been hiding all these years. I thanked Scott for taking the time to speak with me before moving on to the next person to interview. With my curiosity regarding the Grey Door still heightened, I figured the next person to speak to would be one of the more troublemaking attendees of the daycare. I had to know more about what went on inside that room, and perhaps one of them could tell me. After doing more background checks, I managed to track down a young woman whom we'll refer to as Alice. She had been arrested 2 weeks ago for spraying graffiti and was charged for vandalism. Rather than spend time in jail, she agreed to do 4 months of community service. From what I read about her records, it seemed that this wasn't the first time she'd gotten in trouble with the law. "Were you always this much trouble?" I asked her. Alice shrugged. "Maybe." I wasn't sure how easy it would be to get the answers I wanted from her. She seemed like the type who would only cooperate if either she would get some sort of advantage or if it meant less time behind bars. "I need to know about Happy Sun Daycare," I pointed out to her. "Do you remember anything about the Grey Door?" For a brief second, a hint of fear flashed in her eyes. Her face became pale as a few beads of sweat trickled down her forehead. "That was a long time ago," Alice pointed out. I replied, "Surely you must have remembered something. Records show you were 10 when you attended. Are you sure you can't recall anything?" Alice took a few deep breaths and began to regain her composure. If the mere mention of the grey door room was enough to put fear into her after all these years, I couldn't help but dread what horrors she could have experienced. Here was someone who had run-ins with the law, someone who had been arrested for various crimes, primarily theft, vandalism, and trespassing. And yet it was something from her childhood that caused the most fear of being punished. Why? "Okay, I'll tell you. But you gotta promise never to say that I told you anything, got it?" Alice sighed. I reassured her. "I won't reveal any names. That'll be strictly confidential." "You see, I was playing outside in the playground," she began to explain. "I remember wanting to play on the swings. Another kid claimed he got there first and had dibs on them, but before I knew it, we were in a big argument. I lost control. Next thing I knew, he was on the ground crying. I must have pushed him when we were arguing. One of the teachers came up and grabbed me by the arm and dragged me inside. She told me that I would be taken to what the other kids called the grey door room as punishment." "What was inside the room?" I asked in anticipation. Alice took another deep breath and let out a shudder and a sigh. The room was mostly empty. I remember the floor was nothing but dirt ground, and the only light was a dingy old bulb, barely lit up anything. The teacher just shoved me in and slammed the door shut. At first I tried pounding on the door and screaming. I cried for anyone to let me out. It was so dark and cold and I was so scared. And I heard something. Something was behind me. I turned around and I remember screaming louder than I'd ever screamed in my life. I frowned in concern. "What did you see?" "It was a dog. Or at least, I think it was a dog." She choked back a few tears. "I didn't get a good look at it since it was so dark. All I remember was it was the biggest and ugliest dog I had ever seen. That thing had glowing yellow eyes, huge sharp teeth, and was covered in black shaggy fur. And before I knew it, it snarled and lunged at me. I ran as fast as I could, screaming and begging for anyone to come and save me. It grabbed onto my skirt with its teeth and tried to pull me towards it. I tripped and fell, but I managed to kick it in the face a couple of times to get it to let go. Then it lunged at me again. But luckily for me, the door finally opened and one of the teachers pulled me out of the room and slammed the door shut before the dog could get me again." So there was a dog after all. The stories were starting to come together. Margaret's story about hearing screams and growling, Scott's story about horrified kids who had been sent to the grey door room, and now there was Alice's story about being sent to that room and being attacked by some sort of large, vicious dog. Still, I had to know more. Why did they use a dog? Why did they cover it up? Perhaps the people working at Happy Sun Daycare were afraid that such a punishment would be too extreme to use on children. Or maybe they feared being sued by some animal rights group. I then thanked Alice for her time and set forth to find the next person to talk to. Maybe another one of the employees. If I was lucky, I might be able to get one of them to reveal the truth about what was going on in the grey door room. Once again, I began searching through the records of anyone who had ever worked at Happy Sun Daycare. It took some time to find someone who was willing to talk to me. Most former employees I asked were either too busy or simply didn't want to give an interview. A few of them said various profanities as well. I couldn't tell if they were angry that I had learned about what was going on all those years ago, or if they were afraid of what might happen if they revealed any more secrets to me. Still, I managed to track down at least one person who was willing to tell me his experiences working at Happy Sun Daycare. Mr. Smith, as we'll call him, worked as a janitor at the daycare back when it was still running. He had managed to get the job only because his aunt was in charge of one of the head offices there as well. However, Mr. Smith had moved to another town since the daycare closed years ago. This meant I couldn't interview him in person, so we sent each other emails instead. Mr. Smith explained that he had some form of narcolepsy since he was a teenager and a history of sleepwalking as well. Doctors couldn't figure out what was causing his condition, but they couldn't find any other adverse health effects linked to it either. This still made it difficult for him to find work, though. He told me that he was grateful that his aunt managed to get him a job at Happy Sun Daycare. I had so many questions, and well, I wasn't sure which one to ask first. After I got his first response, I wrote back to him. I wanted to know how he was able to hold his job despite his condition. Was he on medication for it? How did the other employees and the children treat him? A couple of days passed before I got any response from him. I quickly opened the latest email response from Mr. Smith and began to read. He replied that his aunt would mix him a special herbal tea for him that would keep his narcolepsy in check. She apparently strongly believed in herbal medicine and said that it was the better than any standard medicine on the market. Mr. Smith wrote about how the tea was quite bitter and how he hated drinking it, but he had to drink it if he wanted to keep his job. Though, on occasion, his aunt would run out of the leaves needed for the tea and he'd end up falling asleep. This prompted another employee to go and make sure he didn't accidentally hurt himself or others. As for how others treated him, Mr. Smith explained in his letter that the children were generally very nice to him. Most of them were quite curious and would ask him a lot of questions while he worked. A few would generally act as a nuisance, but he didn't recall any of them being too much trouble. On the other hand, the other employees seemed to have a sense of uneasiness around him. He explained how he felt that they seemed extremely cautious around him. Also, he pointed out that his aunt always kept a close eye on him. He wasn't sure if this was due to his condition or for some other reason, though. That just caused more questions to form in my mind. Why were the other employees uneasy around him? Was it because he was the nephew of one of the higher-ups? Or was there another reason? And there was the matter of his aunt keeping a close eye on him. Maybe they were trying to keep the whole issue regarding the grey door room a secret from him. Perhaps they were afraid that he would find out about the dog and would contact the police. I had to know if he knew anything about the room. I quickly wrote a reply and asked if he knew anything about a large empty room and the children being attacked by some sort of large dog. Another couple of days passed before I got another response from Mr. Smith. I opened the reply and began to read. He said that he didn't remember any sort of dog at the daycare. In fact, he pointed out that animals weren't allowed on the property and that he would set traps to keep the squirrels and mice out. His aunt was very strict about no pets being allowed as well, most likely due to any potential allergies the kids might have. Mr. Smith explained in his reply that perhaps the dog that Alice claimed had attacked her was just someone in a cheap-looking costume, that the room was kept barely lit so the kids in there wouldn't realise it was a fake, and that the scratches and bites were just the result of them tripping and accidentally scratching themselves on some dirt. To my surprise, he had been in the grey door room himself several times as well. Strangely, he pointed out that they were always when he hadn't had any tea to drink and would wake up in the room. He wasn't sure if anyone had simply moved him there so he could sleep without being in anyone's way, or if he had been sleepwalking again and just stumbled in there by mistake. Mr. Smith explained that the room was originally going to be a large storage closet for various arts and crafts related supplies, but was never finished due to budget cuts. He wrote in his reply that his aunt didn't want the area to go to waste, so they decided to use it as a means to punish misbehaving children. In his opinion, someone probably bought a dog costume and would wear it while terrorising any children sent to the room as a means of instilling fear of punishment into their minds. I sent one last email to Mr. Smith, thanking him for taking the time to reply to my messages. The whole thing about Happy Sun Daycare was starting to piece together. From what I had gathered via the various interviews from both students and employees, children who misbehaved were sent to a large empty space called the Grey Door Room. That there was a dog, or possibly just someone in a dog costume, that would chase any child sent in there. And finally, that said child would be pulled to safety before the dog could cause any serious harm. There was only one thing left to do. I was going to head inside Happy Sun Daycare and investigate the infamous Grey Dorm Room for myself. I had to see for myself if there was anything that could solve this strange cover-up. Several minutes passed as I drove out into the countryside and towards the abandoned building. I parked the car in front of the driveway and took a few deep breaths. The front door was unlocked, which was lucky for me. I gently pushed the door open and began to look inside. The interior was dingy and covered in a layer of dust. Cobwebs spread out over various desks and chairs that hadn't been used in quite some time. A musty smell filled the house and mixed with the odour of feces and urine from the rats that had now made the place their home. It was nauseating, to say the least. After I explored different areas, I soon found the foreboding grey door that was said to lead to the dreaded room. The door was quite heavy, and it took me several tries just before I managed to force it open. Just like how Alice had described it, the room was dark and empty, with a dirt floor and a dingy bulb. Said bulb had burned out long ago, so I used an old desk to prop the door open to see anything. I could see faint blood stains on the ground and on the wall, but I couldn't tell who or what the blood belonged to. There were also strange markings on the wall as well. I took a closer look and could have sworn they resembled claw marks of some sort. As I continued to examine the room, I noticed various footprints in the dirt. Many were faded or had been trampled over one another, but I could still make out a few. Most of them were the footprints of children. They looked like the children had been running away from something. There was one other distinct set of footprints that caught my attention. I examined them closely. I could definitely make out the distinctive foot pads, claws, and individual toes on at least one of the prints. This wasn't some person in a cheap costume. Happy Sun Daycare had been using a dog to terrorize children. I had to let people know what they had been hiding for all those years. However, as I made my way out the daycare and to my car, there was one aspect about those footprints that made me uneasy. Since when do dogs walk on two legs? And that's the end of Happy Sun Daycare. I chose that one because you don't always really see creepypastas and scary stories on the internet that focus around werewolves. And I thought that was, a little bit different, because I think werewolves are a really cool piece of lore. So we're almost at the end. One last story, and then I'll get out of your hair. And we're going to do the strangest security tape I've ever seen, which is again also a little bit different, but it's one of the OG creepypastas, I think. So this creepypasta was written by Powerhawk Mash. I work at a gas station in rural Pennsylvania. It's a boring job, but it's pretty easy and it pays all right. A few weeks ago, this new guy started. I'll call him Jeremy. Jeremy is weird. He's about 25 or 26 and he hardly speaks, but he's got the creepiest laugh I've ever heard. My boss and I have both noticed this, but it's never been a problem, so there's not much we can do about it. Customers have never complained about him, and he's always done his job fairly well. Up until a few weeks ago, anyway. That's when things started going missing. Employee theft can be a problem at any business that sells consumer goods, and there's only one person working at a time at this gas station because it's a pretty small place. About 2 weeks ago, my boss started noticing that we were short on motor oil. At first, it was a few containers at a time, then entire shelves and boxes from the back room. Pretty soon, entire shipments would be gone the day after we got them, and it would always be right after Jeremy's shifts. My boss had checked the security camera tapes from every single night he worked, but he could never catch him in the act. Jeremy would lock up at closing, and then the motor oil would be gone the next day. My boss usually takes the tapes home with him to try and catch Jeremy stealing, but his daughter had a softball game last night, so he asked me to watch the tape for him. He offered to pay me overtime, under the table, so obviously I took that offer. There are 3 cameras, so he gave me 3 different tapes to check. I figured it would be a long night, but I'm trying to save up for vacation, so I really needed the money. I took the tapes home, popped them into an old VCR, and sat back. 2 days ago, the last time he worked, Jeremy started at 4 p.m. Everything seemed pretty normal at first. He counted up his drawer, switched off with the girl who was working before him, and waited for a customer. The first person who came in was Mrs. Templeton. The timestamp on the video read 4:03. She's a regular. She picked up her cigarettes and a newspaper and paid with a 20. Nothing unusual there. The next customer was some local guy named Ron. He drives a motorcycle, usually comes in every few days. He filled up his tank, got a bag of beef jerky, paid with his credit card, and then left. Next was some guy with a cowboy hat. I'd never seen him before, but we get plenty of strangers passing through, just like at any gas station. He got $40 worth of diesel fuel, paid with a $100 bill, and went on his way. I sat back and sighed.
The only thing more boring than doing this job is watching someone else do it. My boss's offer was enough to keep me watching though, so I left the tape on. Everything seemed pretty normal. I had a feeling that if Jeremy was stealing motor oil, he knew we were suspicious of him by now. I didn't expect him to be dumb enough to let us catch him on camera. Things stayed boring and routine until about 5 o'clock. At 5:03, Mrs. Templeton came back in. She must have forgotten something. But she didn't. She bought the same pack of cigarettes as before, and the same newspaper. She paid with another 20. That's odd, I thought, but then again, she's a little absent-minded. I thought Jeremy should have told her she already got her smokes, but it's not against the rules to sell somebody the same thing twice. That's when Ron came in again. He bought another tank of gas and the same pack of beef jerky. He paid with his credit card again. No big deal, I figured this was just a weird coincidence. Mrs. Templeton is forgetful, and Ron probably owns more than one Harley. That's when the guy in the cowboy hat came back in. I felt a chill run down my spine. Don't get diesel. Don't get diesel, I found myself whispering to my empty living room. But he did. He got $40 worth of diesel fuel and paid with another $100 bill. Every move he made was identical to his first visit, right down to the way he scratched his nose before he walked out. Either this guy is rich, owns a lot of trucks, and just moved into town, or something really bizarre was happening. I kept watching. Every customer for the next hour was the same as before. Every single one. I was seriously freaked out, and then at 6:03, Mrs. Templeton walked back in. She bought her cigarettes and newspaper again and paid with the 20 again. I thought I was going to lose it. I only watched another half an hour before I started fast-forwarding through the rest. It was all the same. Every customer would come in at the exact same times, exactly 1 hour apart. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sneaky motherfucker Jeremy had messed with the tapes. He'd run a loop over his first hour of business over and over. That wasn't the case. There are windows around the cash register area that the camera covers, and I watched the sunlight fade as time ran on. Jeremy's routine didn't loop over. He swept, mopped, restocked, and did all his duties exactly how you would expect. But the same customers kept coming in. I was panicking at this point. Something was seriously wrong with what I was seeing, and I had no explanation for it. I skipped ahead to when he locked up and walked out to his car. He hadn't stolen anything, but I kept watching just to make sure. I fast-forwarded one last time, to about midnight. At exactly 12:03, out of nowhere, Jeremy's face pops up on camera. I don't mean he moved his head into view. I mean that 1 second the store was empty. The next second, his face was all I could see. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at me. I was sure of it. I screamed and fumbled for the remote. By the time I'd grabbed it, he was gone, just as soon as he had left. One frame, he was there. The next, he wasn't. My hands were shaking like crazy, but I popped in another tape. The other indoor camera shows the back area by the cash register, and I would be able to see how he got up to put his face in the camera like that. I skipped ahead to 12:03, but there was nothing. I would have been able to see him standing on a chair or something on this tape, but he wasn't there. I didn't see him enter the store at all after he left. It's like he wasn't really there. He doesn't know the security code, and no alarms were triggered that night after he locked up. What I did see, however, was that at 12:03, the motor oil vanished off the shelf. All of it. Same as Jeremy's face. 1 second it was there, and the next it wasn't. I turned that tape off and went to bed, but I didn't get a wink of sleep. My body is exhausted right now, but my mind is racing. That tape was undoubtedly the creepiest, most disturbing thing I've ever seen in my life. I work in a few hours. My boss asked me to bring the tapes back in and let him know what I found. But really, what the hell am I going to say? Jeremy works the night shift tonight, directly after me, and the plan is that my boss is going to come in just before I leave and confront him with me, as I'm supposed to be the one who caught him stealing. I have no idea what I'm going to do. I suppose I'll have to show my boss the tapes, but I don't want to watch them with him. I never want to see something like that again. I can't get the image of Jeremy just smiling directly into the camera out of my mind. It was the creepiest look I've ever seen on another human being's face. Anyway, I'm going to try again to get some last minute sleep before I have to go in and deal with this. I'll let you guys know what happens. Update, 2:49 p.m. Updating from my phone. Apologies in advance for errors. My boss just finished watching the last of the tapes. I told him what to expect, but you really can't prepare someone for something like that. He's scared shitless. I still am too. And Jeremy is due to come in at 4. We've got a little over an hour to get our shit together, but neither one of us knows what to say to him. Is he just a fucked up guy who likes to steal motor oil and scare the shit out of people? Or is he something else? I don't know if this is crazy, but does anyone think he could have done anything with the time loop? My boss said he never noticed anything like that in the other tapes, but the way he popped up in this one made me think he knew I would be watching. It's like he wanted me to see what he could do. Like he was showing off or something. The way he smiled into the camera was like a little kid showing you a sandcastle they built or something. I don't know, I probably sound crazy. I sure feel the part. I'm going to talk to my boss some more. We have to calm ourselves down and figure out how to handle this. I'll update again tonight, but I have a really bad feeling about how this is going to play out. Update, 4:33 p.m. No sign of Jeremy. Tried calling him, but his phone has been disconnected. We're calling the police. Update, 5:33 p.m. No sign of Jeremy. Tried calling him, but his phone has been disconnected. We're calling the police. Update, 6:33 p.m. No sign of Jeremy. Tried calling him, but his phone has been disconnected. We're calling the police. Update, 7:33 p.m. No sign of Jeremy. Tried calling him, but his phone has been disconnected. We're calling the police. Update, 8:33 p.m. No sign of Jeremy. Tried calling him, but his phone has been disconnected. We're calling the police. Update, 10:58 p.m. Holy shit. Holy shit, holy shit, holy shit. I just got home and saw my previous updates. Things make less sense now than ever. Here's what I can tell you. I went to work. Jeremy never showed up. My boss and I decided to call the police, as you're well aware. When I picked up the phone to call, though, the sun went out. I shit you not, that's what I thought happened. Apparently I blacked out for exactly 5 hours, because when I looked at the clock, it was 9:33. I think I got stuck in Jeremy's time loop, and then I snapped out of it the exact point I blacked out, if that makes sense. But that's when things got really weird. My boss was right next to me when I blacked out, ready to corroborate my story to the cops. When I came to, the phone was in my hand, but it was dead. Not even a dial tone. My boss was still right there, but he wasn't moving. He was standing up, but frozen. I looked at the clock again, and it wasn't moving. The second hand was stuck on the 12. It was 9:33 exactly. The clock on the register and my computer screen wasn't moving either. My phone was frozen. There was even a customer at the register waiting for my boss to get him cigarettes. I'm betting that would have been his 5th pack for the day. I got the fuck out of there. Didn't lock up, didn't turn the lights out, and sorry guys, I didn't grab the security tapes to upload on the internet. Believe me, that was the last thing on my mind. The gas station is on a major highway and cars were parked all along it. Except they weren't parked. They were frozen. The people inside were sitting still as wax statues. I got in my car and prayed that it would start. Thankfully it did. About halfway home, time started up again. The static from the radio turned into music like it's supposed to be, and from what I could tell by listening to the host talk in between songs, no one noticed the time freeze or whatever it was. I was the only one. Well, I'm sure Jeremy noticed as well. I still have no clue where he is or what he's doing. I'm hiding in my room and calling the police again in the morning. I don't know if I ever got through to them before, or if I did, whether they took me seriously. I'm scared for my life at this point. I'll update tomorrow if I can. Final update, 10:33 a.m. I finally fell asleep last night around 4. I've no idea how I did it. I guess exhaustion finally got the best of me. This morning I woke up to my phone ringing. It was my boss. He'd been calling me since about 6. He woke up when time turned back on last night and immediately called the cops. They came by to see what was wrong and he told them everything. The police around here are all small-time guys. They were more concerned with the missing motor oil than anything, but my boss figured he would take it as long as he had their attention. They decided to go looking for Jeremy. We keep all our employees' applications on file. Since Jeremy's just started working here, his was easy to find. They checked the address on it and headed over to his house. You're not going to believe what they found. The address Jeremy listed on his application was an empty lot. Or at least now it is. There used to be a house there, but it burned down in 1993. Being a small town, almost everyone remembers that fire. A family of 4 used to live there way back when. Rumour has it that they had an estranged son who they never really talked to, but I can't say for sure if that's true. What I can say is true is that after an insurance investigation, the fire was ruled an arson. The entire house was soaked in oil and torched with a Molotov cocktail. The entire family was sleeping when it happened. None of them survived. They never caught the guy that did it. Rumour has it that when they tried to contact the estranged son, no one could find him. Anyway, my boss called and told me this, and I freaked out. Then he asked me to come to the gas station. What? Are you crazy? I said, but he assured me that the cops were there with him. Then he dropped a bomb. The FBI were also in town, and they were going to talk to me one way or another, so I might as well come in. It was about 7:15 and I wanted to go back to bed, but figured I wouldn't be able to sleep much more anyway, so I went down. 4 men in suits greeted me and told me to have a seat. We went over everything 2 or 3 times until they got all the details down. I told them about Jeremy, the security tape, last night at work, everything. Finally, after I finished, one of the agents said, "Oh Christ, we've got another one on our hands." Then they made me sign a bunch of papers saying I wouldn't tell anyone what happened, so I can't say much more. I might be breaking the law just by posting this. So now I'm home. I'm not sure what to do with myself. That agent's words when I told him the story are going to haunt me for the rest of my life. Anyway, I've got to go. I have some errands to run today, and then I have to go into work to pick up some tapes. My boss and I think this new guy, Jeremy, he's a complete creep, is stealing motor oil, and I have to watch the security footage to see if I can catch him doing it. I have better things to do, but my boss is paying me overtime under the table, and I'm trying to save up for vacation so I could really use the money. It should be pretty simple. The oil always goes missing right after his shifts. I figure I'll just watch the tapes, catch him in the act, and that will be that. And that was the strangest security tape I've ever seen. And that is the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you liked just sitting here and listening to the stories. Listening to stories when I was a kid always used to send me to sleep, and I hope the candles help set the mood a little bit more too. If you'd like to see any more videos like this, please do let me know. If you did enjoy this video, please feel free to give it a like and subscribe to my channel if you feel that way inclined. Aside from that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And if you're watching this on the 31st of October specifically, I hope you have a beautifully creepy Halloween. Lots of love to every single one of you out there, and I'll see you next time. Bye.